It's about history, policy, and impact. A new perspective on current affairs, bringing experience, insight, civility, and scholarship to the urgent issues of today. It's about our past, present, and future. Your host, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist, Douglas Blackman. From the University of Virginia's Miller Center, this is American Forum.
Welcome back to American Forum. I'm Doug Blackman. For most of the past 50 years, what most Americans learned about the civil rights movement focused on the nonviolence and forgiving oratory of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the bravery and stoic sacrifice of activists like Rosa Parks. More recently, Malcolm X, the American black Muslim leader, always described as militant or fiery, has been elevated as the fierce but ultimately secondary counterpoint to Dr. King. Our guest today argues that fairy tale version of the civil rights era is dangerously oversimplified. Peniel Joseph is a professor of American history at Tufts University and the author of a deeply researched and beautifully written new book in which he challenges the familiar civil rights stories and resurrects the life of Stokely Carmichael, the brilliant young activist who ultimately renounced King's philosophy of nonviolence and introduced to America the term Black Power. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Doug.
We've decided as a nation, it seems, that Martin Luther King is an official national hero. He has an official monument, holiday. He's on the National Mall. We have an official account, and we've all officially accepted that it was nonviolence and the approach of Dr. King that so transformed America. Stokely Carmichael, in that configuration of the story, doesn't seem very important.
Well, I think Stokely is a bridge figure. He represents a bridge figure between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He's a young civil rights activist. He's a student at Howard University. He's actually influenced by both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. He develops a warm personal friendship with Martin Luther King, and I think that's one of the surprising aspects of doing research. He's a bridge figure in other ways, too. He's an anti-poverty and also an anti-war activist. So one of the arguments that I make in the book is that when we think about Martin and Malcolm and that sort of neat trajectory of a period that I've called the heroic period of the civil rights movement, 1954 to 1965, Stokely Carmichael is fundamental to understanding that period because he gives us a bridge, a way of understanding why did the movement go from sort of nonviolent civil disobedience to really a call for political revolution.
Tell us the story that preceded all of that.
He comes to the United States a couple of weeks before his 11th birthday. And it's a really remarkable story because both of his parents are immigrants. There's a point where he's raised just by his paternal grandmother and his aunts in Port of Spain. He comes a couple of weeks before his 11th birthday, and he comes to the Morris Park section of the Bronx. Now, this is a section that's predominantly Italian and Irish and Jewish American. They're the first black family on their block to own a home. And so Stokely is raised predominantly in a largely white world. He becomes one of the first black students at Bronx Science High School, which is really the best high school in New York City, or one of the best high schools, predominantly Jewish. And what's very interesting about him is that he's raised in both a black world and a white world.
But so he goes to Howard as an undergraduate, yes. Right? And then at what point does he get caught up in the actual activism of the movement?
Immediately. You know, he's 19 years old. The sit-in movement starts in February of 1960. And he starts Howard in September of 1960, but he had met some Howard University activists in the spring of 1960. And the reason he goes to Howard is he met them, some anti-nuclear proliferation activists. And he says, you know, what school do you go to? And they say Howard University. And he says, you know, he's going to go to Howard as well. And Howard has a group called the Nonviolent Action Group, which is an arm of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was organized by Ella Baker and other activists after the sit-in demonstrations. And Stokely immediately becomes a part of SNCC. But he goes down to Mississippi after his freshman year, and that's when he really dives into the movement. 1961, he's going to be arrested as a freedom rider, along with people like John Lewis and these heroes of the movement.
And what kind of relationship developed between him and Dr. King?
You know, this is one of the most interesting parts, I think, of Stokely's story, because when we think about Stokely Carmichael, he's the activist who yells Black Power. He's one of the founders of the original Black Panther Party in Lowndes County, Alabama. He's a friend of people like Eldridge Cleaver, Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis. He influences all these people. You would think to yourself that there's no way, when I think about that image, this is this angry young man, that he's going to have any kind of interaction that's positive with Dr. King, that he's going to say Dr. King's some kind of sellout, some kind of Uncle Tom. And it's really not the case. He meets King for the first time in '63, and they develop a warm relationship over the years. He serves as Dr. King's chauffeur and bodyguard in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1964. He marches alongside Dr. King in Selma in 1965. Those are little known facts about Stokely Carmichael. And by '66, along the Meredith March, they become very, very close, right? So when we think about that relationship, Stokely is always going to say in his memoirs and in interviews that he had enormous amounts of admiration for Dr. King. He loved Dr. King, and that Dr. King loved poor Black people, and that he credits King, and this is remarkable, with teaching him how to face racial terror without fear. So it's a very, very interesting relationship. And King looks upon Stokely as a little brother. He looks upon him as somebody who's talented, who's brilliant, who at times is going too far, at times is saying things that King wouldn't say. In other ways, Stokely influences King. I think one of the things that my research has shown is that, the reason why Dr. King comes out so forcefully against the Vietnam War, in part, is because of Stokely Carmichael's example. So there's a real yin and yang between them.
From this vantage point, looking back, we see this period of tremendous amount of activity in exactly this moment in time. Lots of support from young liberal whites, all these students who come down in the summer of '64. Then the great accomplishments of the March on Washington in '63, the Civil Rights Act in '64, Voting Rights Act in '65. And so from the vantage of history, we look back and see a movement that is triumphing and having tremendous success, altering the course of American history in such profound ways. And yet it's exactly that moment that Stokely Carmichael declares Black Power for the first time, and that Bob Moses breaks away from the movement out of frustration in some respects. It largely disappears soon thereafter for a very long time. So the vitriol, the unhappiness of activists like Stokely Carmichael can seem a mysterious thing 50 years later.
Yeah, I think it can. I think that part of the problem with our neat narrative of the heroic period of the civil rights movement is that we don't talk about the fact that the triumphs that we're focusing on, where we celebrate all these different 50th anniversaries, were really based on violence. And when we think about somebody like Lyndon Johnson, President Johnson, and just like President Kennedy, they were compelled to act. Certainly, I think there are points where Johnson shows great leadership. But that leadership is based on a groundswell of grassroots social and political protests. But what I think the general public doesn't get 50 years later is what a supremely dangerous time this was. And this was not a time when the majority of Americans said that, yes, civil rights was a good thing, and that this idea of Black citizenship and robust democracy was a good thing. This was when the fate of millions of Americans was really literally hanging in the balance. An interesting Stokely story is that Stokely writes in the New Republic in January of 1966 about what's going on in Lowndes County and the sharecroppers there and the folks who are being kicked off of plantations for wanting to vote in Lowndes County, Alabama. As late as 1965, Lowndes, there's over 3,000 people there. Most of them are African American. There's only 2 registered Black voters as late as March of 1965. He says that the only way we can have genuine democracy in the United States is if that the Black sharecroppers in Lowndes County not only can participate and vote, but are actually political leaders who are embraced by the United States of America. The political legislation, the legal action, these are things that were compelled because democracy was literally in the balance. Because one thing that is important to note, between 64 and 68, 69, there's going to be hundreds of what we call either race riots, civil disturbances, or urban rebellions in the United States. And that's remarkable. We've never had that much domestic insurgency before or since. So most observers realize, whether they're observers who are connected to the movement, whether they're connected to the political establishment or even the corporate establishment, Ford Foundation or what have you, that democracy is actually imperiled, and it's imperiled because of Jim Crow segregation and because of racial oppression.
The passage of these historic laws didn't necessarily mean that things were going to change, and in Mississippi they didn't immediately. I mean, Stokely and Bob Moses continue to be arrested with lots of others, and I think that's what immediately precedes the famous speech in '66 in which he says Black Power for the first time. But so even though the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act have been passed, what's still happening on the ground that Carmichael is encountering in Mississippi?
Well, I think the great example is the Meredith March. And, you know, the Meredith March is now an iconic march. There's a plaque that's been put up in Greenwood, Mississippi, where Stokely calls for Black Power on June 16, 1966. Black people faced one economic devastation. Most who were living in the rural South were working in the agricultural or working as domestics. When we think about Mississippi, most of the state was still hugely segregated. Most folks did not live in Jackson or other big cities. They lived in small towns, whether they were in the Delta or other parts of Mississippi. When we think about that Meredith March, James Meredith, who had desegregated the University of Mississippi in 1962, actually is shot on the second day of a one-man march through Mississippi. It started in Memphis, and it goes 220 miles to Jackson. He's shot on his second day. He's injured but not killed, and that brings Martin Luther King Jr., and it brings Stokely, and it brings other leaders to Memphis. And so they start to resume the banner of the Meredith March Against Fear. What Stokely and the young activists want is to utilize that march to register Black voters. They end up registering about 4,000 Black voters along the way. But they're also met with really brutal repression. Small towns with names like Grenada, Liberty. This is where democracy was actually fought for and struggled for in the United States. So what's interesting about Black Power is that for Stokely Carmichael, initially he calls for Black Power as a way to produce and advocate for radical social, political, cultural self-determination, initially in service of an expansive vision of democracy, one that's expansive enough to include people like Fannie Lou Hamer. But he says Fannie Lou Hamer is his hero as well, and that since there are millions of more, and I love that he said Fannie Lou Hamer, because really the face of the civil rights movement is actually not Martin Luther King Jr., you know? And it's not even Stokely Carmichael, it's actually Fannie Lou Hamer. It's not even Ella Baker, because Fannie Lou Hamer is one of 16, 17 children born in Ruleville, Mississippi. She is kicked out of her plantation for trying to register to vote in the United States of America. That is remarkable. And so when we think about who's the face of the civil rights movement, it's actually Fannie Lou Hamer, and Stokely was the biggest champion of the poorest people living in the United States.
Fannie Lou Hamer, who famously said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired."
Absolutely, absolutely.
So Carmichael obviously embraces this idea of that aspect of the Black experience and the taking the movement down, in a sense, to the people. This movement that had begun as out of the leadership of Black pastors in the beginning and the sort of the upper levels of Black society. But at the same time, he begins to be more and more critical of the participation of whites in the civil rights movement and goes into this period that's baffling for white liberals. And the same with Bob Moses, when he expressed some similar criticisms, though he's also a bit critical of Stokely's position, as I recall, in terms of where SNCC should go in that particular period. But why was it? What really was the thinking specifically behind why Carmichael ends up saying that whites should organize for good among themselves and African Americans should be those who lead the civil rights movement without the participation of whites? How does he arrive at exactly that view, and why?
Well, I think it's political experiences. I mean, there's a few things that happened to him. One of his good friends, who's a white activist, Jonathan Daniels, is murdered in Alabama in 1965, and that's a death that really impacts Stokely very, very deeply, and most people don't talk about that. I do in the biography. Seeing Sammy Young Jr. Get killed, who's another friend of his who's African American. So there were people dying all around him. There's also, by 1966, in Stokely's eyes, just white condescension. This idea that even the best white activists, or perhaps except for the best white activists, the majority of white Americans still don't want to give up privilege. There's a great speech that he makes October 29th, 1966 at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. It's one of the best speeches he ever makes. And in that speech, he talks about the war in Vietnam, he talks about white privilege, and he talks about democracy. Brilliantly elucidated speech. He talks about the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, he talks about Frantz Fanon, Albert Camus, and what he says in that speech is that the reason why American democracy is not working is not because of black folks. So he flips around the Du Boisian question, because Du Bois has the great question, W.E.B. Du Bois, the great black intellectual, first black to get a PhD from Harvard and founder of the NAACP, says this whole notion of blackness is predicated on one question: how does it feel to be a problem? The idea that black people were the problem in American society. Stokely flips that notion on its head. He says that black people are not the reason American democracy is not working. He says that it's actually white people, and it's because of white privilege, white supremacy. He says it's not black people who are bombing churches. It's not black people who are protesting in mobs when somebody's trying to enter a public school or live in a house, right? Or vote, right? So what's remarkable with that Berkeley speech, at that speech, he announces himself as not just a political radical, but a political revolutionary who's tying issues of race, class, and also war and peace together. That's a speech that really impresses and impacts Martin Luther King Jr. as well, because Stokely comes out against the war in Vietnam, and he challenges there's 10,000 students there. A couple of weeks earlier, Bobby Kennedy had been there. He challenges all the white students at Berkeley to give up white privilege, protest against the war in Vietnam, but also be committed anti-racist organizers, to actually go back to their own communities and organize against racism and white supremacy. So for Stokely, what he does by 66, and I think that white liberals are confused, he's not saying that they're the enemy. He's saying that there's a deeper problem of privilege in the United States that has to be confronted. And so he actually lays down a gauntlet. Not many take that gauntlet. Some in SDS do. Some other organizations try to, Southern Student Organizing Committee and others. But for the most part, it gets lost amid this idea that somehow Stokely's anti-white, that Stokely is saying that white people are the problem, when he's never saying that. He's saying that white supremacy, institutional racism is the problem, and that without truly confronting that, none of us can move forward.
How was he affected by the murder of Jonathan Daniel, the friend of his who's killed on a beautiful Sunday morning in Lowndes County by the deputy sheriff, effectively, of the county, and then who's acquitted of this obvious murder in a matter of hours just a few days later? But how exactly was he affected by that particular incident?
Deeply affected. He attends the funeral in Keene, New Hampshire, of Jonathan Daniels. He brings along his mother, Mae Charles. His mom remembers that it affected him as deeply as anything she ever saw. This is not somebody who was, Stokely Carmichael, most of the time, he deflected serious situations with humor. I mean, he had a huge sense of humor. But with this one, he couldn't. He rarely spoke about Jonathan Daniels. I mean, he was really impacted. He remembered Jonathan Daniels as a white activist who really listened more than he spoke. They talked about philosophy and bonded over different philosophical books together. But he remembered Jonathan Daniels as really this passionate, committed, lovely human being who was murdered. By these racial terrorists in the South. So I think that particularly affected him, and I think that affected him in a way where he started to look upon interracial organizing as something that was dangerous in the Deep South, something that could get people killed, not just black people, but white people killed as well.
Yeah, and as I recall that when Jonathan Daniels was killed and was literally almost cut in half with a shotgun blast, he was, at least according to some who were there, he was shielding an African-American activist, a young woman.
Ruby Sales, yeah, he was. Yes, he was.
What about the death of Dr. King, the impact of that on Carmichael?
Stokely is deeply, deeply torn apart by Dr. King's death. We have to remember, for most of us, when we think about the death of Martin Luther King Jr., Thursday, April 4th, 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee, we didn't know Dr. King. Dr. King is an icon, but he wasn't a personal friend. Stokely had known Dr. King for 5 years, had been invited to his home for dinner. One of the things he says in the aftermath about that a year later is he's being interviewed and he's out of the country, he's in Algiers, and he says that he loved Dr. King, he truly, truly loved Dr. King. Now this is Stokely Carmichael, Black Power revolutionary, saying that he loved Dr. King and that he would have taken a bullet for Dr. King, that he wished it would have been him instead of Martin Luther King Jr. So really, really devastating. And he's gonna have a couple of different responses. On one level, he's gonna be in DC demanding that stores along U Street close down, demanding. But also telling people that they better go home and not have violence in the streets. In another context, during the same period, he's going to be waving a gun around and saying that, the revolution has come, and if you don't have your gun, don't be out here in the street. So he's going to have a couple of different responses. He's going to gravitate towards the Black Panther Party for self-defense, where he's named prime minister, try to organize that group. But eventually, he's going to leave the United States and settle in West Africa. But I think with King's death, he thinks that the last hope for race relations domestically has died along with King.
Let's take a short break, and when we come back, let's talk about his decision to leave America and what that meant in his life and for the civil rights movement. Now we're back with Peniel Joseph, who's written an important new book, a biography of Stokely Carmichael, the civil rights activist who introduced the term Black Power to the civil rights movement in 1966. You were just saying in the last segment of the show that it was after Dr. King's death in 1968 that Stokely Carmichael makes the decision to leave America at a point of despair about what future there might be for progress around race domestically in the United States. But what was it he hoped to accomplish by going to Africa?
Well, this is interesting because he left the country for 5 months in 1967. He takes this whirlwind tour. He starts out in London, he goes to Cuba, Vietnam, China, Algiers, and ends up in Conakry, Guinea. And Conakry is an important site of West African anti-colonial struggle in the 1960s. Guinea had been liberated in 1958 under Sékou Touré. They had refused France's offer of being kind of a colony to continue that relationship. The French leave in a huff and sort of take all the infrastructure with them. By 1967, when Stokely visits, Guinea had been a site of African Americans coming to Guinea as part of this Pan-African revolution. Harry Belafonte had brought a group of SNCC activists, including Fannie Lou Hamer. And very famously, there's a great story about Fannie Lou Hamer, who's in a bathtub, who finds out that the president of Guinea, Sékou Touré, is in the hotel room. And she's saying, there's no way I can get ready in time to see this man. Eventually, she does. So when we think about Guinea and Conakry, it's very, very important. He also meets Kwame Nkrumah, who's living in Guinea. And Kwame Nkrumah had been the first prime minister and president of Ghana, the Gold Coast, the former Gold Coast, which was liberated by 1957. So he's deposed in 66, and he's in Guinea too. So meeting up with Kwame Nkrumah and Sékou Touré really convinces Stokely in 67 that he needs to return there and work with both men to be part of this Pan-African revolution. He's convinced that Africa provides a natural headquarters and base for the Black revolution in a way that the United States doesn't. Because the United States, African Americans will never be able to have their own land base, their own secure parameters in the United States. So he'd always been talking about Black nationalism. He'd always read about Pan-Africanists, even in the 1950s. But going overseas and meeting up with revolutionaries, including he goes to Tanzania, he goes to Algiers, where he meets up with the Algerian revolutionary government, the FLN. He becomes convinced that by organizing in Africa, he can help create a United States of Africa along the lines that Nkrumah had always talked about. One army, one leader, one state that will provide much more political leverage for Black Americans in the United States.
How would that then have impacted the folks back in the Mississippi Delta, the sharecroppers who were still there?
Well, I think from that perspective, it's really, when we think about Africa, Africa obviously, many different nation states, doesn't have a single currency. If you could imagine sort of an African Union along the likes of the European Union, or a nation state that had one leader that was hugely respected, better ties with the United States, would provide political leverage for African Americans in a way that they just don't have now. Because when we think about our foreign policy, Africa is not a major player in the same way as other countries are, right? So I think the thinking went from the reverberating effect that a united, strong Africa, as really sort of Africa as a first world power instead of a third world power, would have. And also this idea of Black consciousness and Pan-African consciousness. Kwame, Stokely Carmichael is going to change his name to Kwame Toure by 1979 in honor of Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Toure. And he's going to say in speeches all around the world, but when he returns to the United States on speaking tours, that Black people are all African people, this idea that we are all Africans. So from that perspective, he's organizing for political consciousness that goes beyond just race pride. So this is beyond Black is beautiful. This is this idea that Black people, wherever they are, New Orleans to Nigeria, Birmingham, Alabama, to Bandung, Indonesia, right? Haiti to Harlem, that they're African people, and that's going to be his argument by the 1970s and 80s.
He's also challenging by doing that, as did other activists who flirted with going back to Africa or who did. But it's also challenging some of the attitudes among African Americans about whether being African, quote unquote, is a good thing or a bad thing, or whether there's connectivity. And I take it also from the African side, a certain amount of uncertainty about what Black Americans are really about in their interactions. So he's wading into that very complicated set of issues at the same time.
He is, and through his own example, one of the interesting things about living in Guinea, Guinea is a place that has a hard time keeping the electricity on, right? He finds a real rapport with the people, and he thinks, and he writes this in his memoirs as well, Guinea reminds him of Mississippi. It reminds him of Alabama. The folks in Mississippi didn't have electricity in the Delta, the folks that he was dealing with. They didn't have indoor plumbing, right? So he doesn't look upon living among the people in Guinea, and at times he has more access, at times he has less, depending on where he's living in Guinea at the time. But he doesn't look upon Africa as this backwards country, this backwards continent. And I think you're exactly right. He's challenging Black America's vision of Africa too, because what's interesting is that racism is a very pernicious phenomenon in the sense of it doesn't just impact white people or people who are non-people of color. It impacts everybody, right? So because you're Black, it doesn't mean that somehow you think of Africa as, that's the greatest thing since sliced bread, right? If all these images and these messages have been saying Africa is the worst thing in the world, one of the best parts of Stokely's speeches in the 60s, he talks about growing up in New York City and watching Tarzan on television and going to the movies to see Tarzan. And he says, when I was a kid, I wanted Tarzan to beat back all the natives and all the savages. He said, I'd go to the movies and I'm identifying with Tarzan.
He's rooting for Tarzan.
He's rooting for Tarzan. And he says, now I know that I was wrong. And he says, when I see those movies again, I want the natives to beat the hell out of Tarzan. Right? And that's what, so what's interesting about Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Toure, he, especially as a young activist, he admits to not knowing all the answers, and he also admits to being part of this group of people who didn't realize what was happening to them, who didn't realize these negative images and messages about Blackness. When he's in London, he's got a great story with reporters where he's talking about being raised in Trinidad and how, as a young man, when there was Princess Margaret had visited Trinidad, and it's sort of like they're playing Rule Britannia, and he had a little flag of the Union Jack, and he says that he's embarrassed about the memory, right? He's embarrassed that, he was part of the British Empire. This is before Trinidad is liberated, right? And he was a proud member of the British Empire when he was 9 and 10 years old. So he becomes this Pan-Africanist in part because he realizes the way in which this idea of Western civilization, this idea of anti-Black imagery really even had infected his own soul as a young boy, and he's determined to have this different perspective, this perspective of a love for Africa, this perspective that Blackness is not only is it not bad, that it's something people should be proud of, and also that Africa is a continent that is not in need of rescue so much as restoration.
The notion of Pan-Africanism is a very powerful one still in this period of time, and many others are also fascinated by it. Du Bois had moved to Africa and died there in Ghana in 1963, the day before the March on Washington. Yes. Bob Moses, Stokely's partner, or another player in SNCC, also goes to Africa out of frustration with what's happening in the U.S. There were still others. Charles Ogletree, the great intellectual at Harvard Law School, even today, visited Du Bois, I believe, at a Pan-African Congress, and was fascinated as a young man with Pan-Africanism still. But in the end, Moses comes back, realizes that, okay, I'm not actually accomplishing there what I thought I was going to, and comes back to the United States and sort of sets back to work again, sort of goes back to the business of it in another way. In the end, was Carmichael's decision to stay in Africa to essentially to the end of his life, was that something of a cop-out on what he had worked for in the beginning and the people that he had connected with in America?
No, I don't think so. I think it was a continuation. I think it was definitely a continuation. And for him, it was the right thing to do. He becomes Kwame Toure, and he becomes really, when he died, the New York Times said he was the unapologetic voice of the 60s, right? And I look upon Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Toure, as somebody who was always advocating for Black humanity and human rights, but he did so unapologetically. So what's interesting about the 60s is 20 years later, you had people writing different memoirs and basically apologizing and saying, you know what, we're sorry that we were just so loud, that we disrupted things, maybe we took things too far. Kwame Toure, Stokely Carmichael never did this. He says, if anything, in the 60s, we didn't realize how big economic exploitation was, how deep the roots of racial injustice were. We thought we might be able to finish this in a 100-yard dash, and as an older man, he speaks and says, I realize now it's a marathon. It's gonna take generations, and it's gonna be beyond my lifetime, but he's always convinced optimistically that it will occur. So I don't think it was a mistake. I think it certainly shows a kind of optimism, and one of the reasons I think he was very, very optimistic even till the end is that as a young man, he had actually seen incredible things occur. Can you imagine? He's 18 years old, you go to Howard University, and his mother is saying, look, I don't want you involved in any of these sit-ins, don't do this. He calls up Mae Charles, 1961. He tells her, look, I'm about to go down to the Deep South. I'm going to be arrested. Reporters are gonna call you. And he says, don't embarrass me, Mom, please, I'm begging you. He says, tell them that you're proud of me when they ask you about me. She tells him, please don't go, please don't go. You can't convince Stokely Carmichael about anything that he doesn't want to be convinced about. He definitely goes. He is arrested. And when the reporters call her up and neighbors say, is that your son Stokely in jail? Mae Charles, his mother, replies as her son had begged her to. She said, yes, it is Stokely who's in jail, and I'm so proud of him, I don't know what I'm gonna do. He had seen all these miracles occur. I mean, can you imagine being in prison in a prison farm with John Lewis, who's gonna become a congressman, and this lion, this venerated figure, but at the time, no one knows. No one knows. And he says that at that moment when he's in prison, he realizes that the movement is his life. He never gave up hope in this idea of racial justice, economic justice, even as he was very much realistic about the political conditions that Black people were in and the challenges that he faced and the challenges that the community faced in the United States and around the world. And
he was a withering critic of everyone that he thought was needing of criticism. Yes. I mean, he fought with his friend John Lewis, who you just mentioned, to take control of student of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee early on, and then you write that on his final visit to the United States, within the year before he died in 1998, that his final protest of sorts is he goes to the headquarters of the NAACP and stages a sit-in against another fellow SNCC activist, Julian Bond,
yeah,
who's then the chairman of the NAACP. So right to the very end, he's also critical of the vestiges of the traditional civil rights movement.
Absolutely. He answers the phone ready for revolution. And that's, you know, that's his motto, and that was the motto of the Guinean revolution. But he's a committed, lifelong political activist. So the idea that somehow Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Toure cut and run and didn't continue, that's a mistake. I mean, he continued to be an activist, he continued to be an organizer, and he really continued to believe in this idea of revolution long past its expiration date in the American and global imagination. He was not going to become a mayor of a big city, just get a suit and tie. He was an impossibly handsome man. He could have been anything, but he didn't want to do that. He was convinced and believed in the political activism of his youth, that he hadn't misspent his youth, that this was that kind of political service for social justice was something that he believed until he died.
Let's take another short break, and when we come back, let's talk about what Stokely Carmichael means for America in 2014, approaching 2 decades after his death. We'll be right back. And now we're back with Peniel Joseph talking about the life of Stokely Carmichael, the civil rights activist who coined the phrase Black Power in 1966 and who died in 1998. Now, at the time of Stokely Carmichael's death, Barack Obama had been a state senator in Illinois for a year at that point. Is there any chance that Stokely Carmichael in any way ever had any awareness of Barack Obama or had ever heard his name?
You know, he might have heard his name maybe from people in Chicago. Certainly, Barack Obama knew who Stokely Kwame Toure was, and he saw him at Columbia University in the early 80s and writes about it in Dreams from My Father. He says that, you know, Stokely was talking about, you know, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, revolution, and he says that somebody asked him a question and he just, you know, shuts down the question, and he says that Kwame Toure's eyes glowed inward, the eyes of a madman or a saint. And the interesting thing about that, and I talk about that in the book, is that Barack Obama feels more comfortable with early SNCC, this idea of come, let us build a new world together. And you know, black, white, standing side by side, united, holding hands, and doesn't realize Kwame Toure's role in the early SNCC. He was right there on the front lines with those folks. He was with people like Tom Hayden, who was in Macomb, Mississippi. He was with Bob Moses. He was with Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, all these different folks. So what's interesting about Carmichael's legacy for Barack Obama is that even as Barack Obama has rightfully lionized both Dr. King and John Lewis, and has talked about the Joshua generation, you know, that's what's after Selma. Without Kwame Toure and Stokely Carmichael, there's absolutely no Barack Obama. Stokely's radicalism, right, is the first black mayor there in 1983. So the interesting thing about Stokely's legacy is that even as it's not politically correct to acknowledge that legacy really abounds. You know, they're absolutely, he's integral to the progress that we've made as a nation, even as he would have been a critic of Barack Obama politically. He wouldn't have criticized him personally because Stokely believed in this idea of racial solidarity, but he would have criticized political choices that the president has made, but he's certainly a key part of why our racial landscape has changed in the last 50 years.
You made a decision that relates in some respects to some of this, but you made a decision in writing the book you only spent about a chapter of the book on the Africa years, which is more than half of Stokely Carmichael's life, or right about half of his life is in Africa. So you don't spend a lot of time on that in the book, and in the end you title the book Stokely Carmichael instead of Kwame Toure. So why was that? Why is it the name not the one that he lived by for 30 years or thereabouts?
Well, I think it's, for the last 20 years, it was Kwame Toure. One, it had to do with sources too, in terms of there's no open archive for the Africa years, so we're still historians to get a day-to-day account of what he was doing. That's still going to be left in the future until that's deposited in an open public archive. We're going to have a hard time with that. But two, I think that when you think about Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Toure and Stokely Carmichael are not just two different people. I mean, the name Kwame Toure grows out of his activism as Stokely Carmichael. So even as Stokely Carmichael, he's a Pan-Africanist. He's a Black Power icon. He's this anti-war activist. So I thought that name was very, very important and befitting in that sense. So it wasn't as if, as Kwame Toure, he rejected what he had done as Stokely Carmichael. It was more of an evolution. And certainly, I think on the world stage, on the global stage, the part of his life that impacted the world the most was the activism that he was doing in the 60s, right? But the argument that I make is it's not just the activism from the Black Power years, it's also the civil rights activism, because one of the major mistakes of our narrative of the heroic period of the civil rights movement is actually writing Stokely Carmichael out of the first half of the 1960s, 60 to 65, when both from the sit-in movements through Selma, he's a major part of all those movements. He doesn't show up at the March on Washington, but he brings a Mississippi contingent to the March on Washington. He's in Albany, Georgia. He's in Mississippi. He's in Alabama. He's with Martin Luther King Jr., and he's one of the key architects of Freedom Summer, and he's at the Democratic National Convention. So it's a very interesting perspective on the civil rights movement when we see this young man who we're going to meet as this firebrand in 1966, when we pause and we say, wow, he's in that picture in 1960. And then you say, in 61, he was a freedom rider? I didn't know Stokely Carmichael was a freedom rider. So it gives us a whole different perspective. So I think the title of Stokely is befitting because it encompasses not just his domestic activism, but really his global activism. You know, Fidel Castro meets him as Stokely Carmichael. Kwame Nkrumah, Sekou Toure meet him as Stokely Carmichael. So he's this, you know, the FBI is searching for Stokely Carmichael.
Back to the topic of President Obama and sort of how he perceives, we presume, you haven't talked to him about it, have you?
No.
But how we perceive he might view Stokely Carmichael and vice versa. Mm-hmm. But the whole term Black Power invoked such an extraordinary response from whites at the time that it was invoked, yes. And then for many years after that. Just the words Black Power were so unsettling to so many whites at the time. And in some respects, President Obama's apparent reluctance to move very aggressively or overtly on racial issues feels to me at times like fearing a similar kind of backlash to the one that came just to those words, Black Power, a generation ago. But what was it that was so powerful about just those two words?
Yeah, I think those two words evoked a lot of both fear in white Americans, but they also evoked a lot of promise and hope among a group of Black Americans. So I think that this idea of Black Power was very much tapping into cultural and political fears that existed in America. This idea of this fear, and these fears are paradoxical because there was a paradoxical fear of Black anti-white violence, even though historically African Americans have been the victims of anti-Black violence by both the state and white Americans, right? There's a fear of Black sexual misconduct, even though historically Black Americans have been the victims of sexual misconduct and rape by white Americans. So what's interesting about cultural racism is that it turns reality on its head. It says that, look, everybody who's incarcerated, who's Black, has committed a crime, when in reality, that's not the case. It says that Black people who are poor just don't want to work, when in reality, that's not the case. So I think when this image of Black Power, this notion, it evoked very visceral fears, but these fears were racist fears. They were race-based fears. And that's why Stokely, I think his great credit, always refused to not use the term. This idea that just because you put Black in front of it, that means that it's only for Black people. he was saying that this is completely wrong because we lived in a society where white was considered universal. White was considered the bare indicator of humanity, right? And he was saying that's not true. That's not necessarily the case. So I think that Black Power really evoked a lot of fears, but it taught us a lot of lessons because it's really through that call of Black Power, not only do we get things like Black studies and Black elected officials, and really a new Black cultural understanding. We think about the Black arts, we think about Black literature and poems and poetry. The country didn't understand things like white privilege. And it's Black Power, with the book that Stokely co-writes with Charles Hamilton, that introduces the term institutional racism to the lexicon too. Before Black Power, there was a misunderstanding. People thought that the problem was personal individual prejudice, which can actually be bad, but an individual usually, unless they're owner of a large corporation or they're an elected official, doesn't have sway over thousands or millions of people. But that term, institutional racism, which comes out of the Black Power analysis of American society and American democracy, was very, very important. So I think on one level, it evoked and provoked fears, but it also provoked a larger investigation of race relations and identity and race and class and gender, and what do we mean by small d democracy in the United States.
It also always struck me that Black Power was such an unsettling idea to a lot of whites in the country, not just in the South, in part because they well knew that African Americans had every reason to do, had a complete moral basis for almost any kind of response they might undertake, and whites lived in fear, as they had for 300 years, of some sort of an uprising by African Americans that would become violent, and Black Power seemed to speak to that possibility in a live way. As you say, Carmichael insists on the term, sticking to the term all the way through, but Black Power does become, is a term and that goes off in some other directions as well. He's involved in starting the Black Panthers, but then he disassociates from Black Panthers, and then it evolves to become a very different thing, and eventually criminal activity associated with that version of the Black Panthers. But what did he think about all of that? What did he think about the ways that Black Power was used that were not the way he intended it?
Well, I mean, he's got a critique of it. I mean, Richard Nixon says Black Power is Black capitalism by 1969, right? So it goes off in many different directions. I mean, he realizes that he can't control that term and that movement. So it goes off in the directions that are sometimes political, sometimes educational, sometimes grassroots. There's going to be tenants' rights and welfare rights activists who are also Black Power activists. I think he's going to have a criticism, and he's going to argue that the highest expression of Black Power is Pan-Africanism. So he's going to say that what we need to talk about is Pan-Africanism. He comes back, to Howard University. He's married at this point to Miriam Makeba, who's really the international South African singer, beautiful singer, who is a global icon, bigger icon than Stokely is. So he's going to say Pan-Africanism is what we should be saying, the Black community globally, instead of Black Power, because Black Power in a way has been co-opted, but they cannot co-opt Pan-Africanism.
Barack Obama, in many respects, I think, is probably seen as a kind of curative to the effect of Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael in terms of the civil rights struggle in the United States, that Obama reassured white Americans, for sure, that being moderate and well-intentioned and supportive of a Black candidate was validation of their views, and that you could be for racial reconciliation without being necessarily for some of the things that Stokely Carmichael stood for. But what would Carmichael, if he were here today, and we don't know for sure what he would say, but what do you think his perceptions on where things stand now? Not specifically in terms of Obama, but in terms of the debate around the Voting Rights Act and other drifts in the thinking and the movement of these ideas in American society today. What would Carmichael think?
Well, I think he would have, Kwame Toure would be criticizing American capitalism, Western imperialism. He'd say that these are all contradictions in the outcome and the consequences of a political system and an economic system that are just serving a few at the expense of the very many. So I think he would have a huge, huge critique. And I think that in terms of Obama, he would say that, on one level, he definitely understands and admires aspect of the fact that there's a Black, or he'd say an African in the White House, because that's what he would say. He'd say he's an African in the White House, and not just because he's half Kenyan. Kwame Toure said, "We are all African people."
He wouldn't be a birther, would he?
No, he wouldn't be a birther. He would. But what's interesting is that he would criticize the policies, and he'd say that, look, the policies are a consequence of a political system where small d democracy doesn't work. There's a great moment where he's in Philadelphia, Mississippi with Dr. King in 1966, and Philadelphia is where the 3 civil rights workers were killed. And there's a big crowd around them in a courthouse, but a very menacing crowd and a threatening crowd, but they have some security around them too. And King speaks, and then Stokely says that the faces he sees in this crowd, he says that this is a country that is paying lip service to democracy in the United Nations, but there's a sickness called racism all around us. And that's why democracy can't work. By the time he becomes Kwame Toure, he really doubles down on this feeling. He's one who says that there is no democracy in the United States, that it's really a rhetoric, but when we think about how does it work tangibly, it doesn't work, and he had experienced that on the ground in the 1960s. So I think that what he would see now with the rollback in terms of voting rights is really the logical consequences of a political system that he would argue was bankrupt, even though as a young man, he had placed faith in that political system and had placed faith that the right alliances could actually transform that political system so that it would be in the hands of poor people. It would be led by poor people who he felt had deep personal sincerity and political integrity.
I believe Dr. King said that that day in Philadelphia, Mississippi in 1966 was the day he felt most threatened in all of the years of the civil rights movement,
yes.
Most physically at risk. Let's finish with this. When we talk about the question of who are the official heroes in the American mythology or the American narrative, obviously Dr. King is on that list. Who would we put up there on Mount Rushmore in addition to the ones who are already there, some of whom seem less heroic today than when they were picked for Mount Rushmore? But when we talk about these, who's a hero and who's not, we often translate that into the notion of role models. Mm-hmm. And it's clear if we say to young people to look to Dr. King as a role model for how to lead your life, it's clear what we mean by that and what the value of that would be, obviously. But in terms of Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Toure, if we say to young people, make him a role model as you choose how to live your life, what exactly would that mean for a young American today?
Well, I think it would mean active citizenship. It would mean speaking truth to power. It would mean valuing dissent, valuing critique, valuing both the intellectual study of political activism in American history, but also the hands-on, pragmatic social movement experiences. I think that he was hugely disciplined. He was hugely courageous, willing to sacrifice his body, risk jail for something he believed in. One of the things that Martin Luther King Jr. said is that a man who doesn't have something he's willing to die for is not fit to live. And I think that Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Toure, one thing that could never be doubted is his personal sincerity. Away from college degrees and away from any other kind of celebrity, he sincerely believed in speaking truth to power and organizing and living among poor people. Another thing that can't be doubted is his love for poor black people. And the interesting thing I should say about that is that these are poor black people that some black people didn't love, that he loved. Right? And he lived with them. So it's not like a drive. Politicians can kiss babies in shotgun shacks and then they go home. Stokely, lived in Mississippi and Alabama on a day-to-day. So I think the thing you can learn that young people can learn is that, one, this is somebody who was bold, who was courageous, who was disciplined, but somebody who was compassionate. And I think his activism was driven in a lot of ways by a love for people. So it wasn't really what he was against, it's what he was for. And I think the fact that one of his biggest heroes was Fannie Lou Hamer, and that so many poor black women mentored him and lived around him and knew that Stokely could represent their interests because he was one of them. He ate from their plates, he babysat their kids, he listened to their stories with not just respect, but really utter devotion and admiration, makes him this really unique individual. And I think that the age that he was at, the willingness to sacrifice, I tell my students this all the time, getting arrested at 19 in Mississippi and spending 49 days in a prison farm, that's no joke. You know, that's not an easy thing to do, even if there's a small group of people who are willing to sacrifice that. And then to experience that arrest and to say that because of this arrest, I realized that this is my life. I mean, that's not an easy thing to tell your mother, right? So I think the lesson that we learned from him is really one of individual personal sacrifice, courage, and really this idea of a well-lived life is not necessarily about making millions of dollars, right? It wasn't about, for Stokely, it wasn't about being elected president of the United States. It wasn't about being a mayor or being a corporate leader. It was about transforming the way in which millions of poor people who were living in a feudal system in the United States, they're living on sharecrop plantation systems that were similar in 1964 to how they had been in 1864, to saying that they had a voice in our democracy, and not just a voice, but that they were going to be leaders in a new vision of American democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is great.